The following program is a production of Pioneer Public Television.
We need to look at what's happening in our own backyard and understand it.
The bottom line from Mark's talk is that it's not your father's climate. We have rapidly expanded the production area of corn and soybeans into there. In fact, there are counties that are intense in those two crops as any county in Iowa, and it's because of climate.
We're not just doing that, though, in a way of thinking about the environmental objectives, which are, of course, very important, but we're thinking about it primarily from an economic perspective, and how is it that we can develop economically viable crops.
This program was made possible by the University of Minnesota, Southwest Minnesota Regional Sustainable Development Partnership, and by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency.
Thank you all so much for coming. The title of our event today is Farmers Leading the Way, because as every single person knows, in truth, the single most important people in any culture are the people who raise the food and take care of the soil. And so, hello and welcome, and we're so happy to have you here.
Okay. So then the issue today that we're discussing is really about that intersection between climate adaptation and agriculture and the food systems. And one good way to help get started with a discussion of a complex issue like this is to consider the most current and relevant information that's available. So it really works well when we can invite some of the best thinkers and presenters on the issue to join us in the discussion and hear from them directly, and then get to ask them questions that are really fresh in our minds when we hear them speak. So welcome, Mark Seeley.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
I salute agriculture always at the outset because of all the sectors, of all the pieces, if you will, of our state infrastructure. I think agriculture, more than any other, has continuously been adapting to climate behavior. I think the agriculture segment of our population in this state, since statehood, 1858, has been all about adapting to climate. And I really believe that. The people who preceded us on this landscape have done plenty of that work. And then lastly, because it's so important, because the extremes really impact us the most, I want to make some comments about some recent work in examining extremes. One point that is often overlooked is how disparate the climate signal change is. Often the media oversimplify and they present a picture to all of us that climate is changing all over the place at an equal pace, and that's far from the truth. Temperature change, as an example from the IPCC reports and our own national climate assessment reports, show that, for example, temperature change across our country is occurring, but it's occurring differently depending on what geography you're looking at. Here in the western Great Lakes region, where we happen to occupy a piece of real estate, we're seeing, as you can see by the pinks and reds, we're seeing net positive change in temperature that's probably the equal of most of the rest of the nation that is seeing change in that direction. Down here, I would point out in the southeastern states, where it's either gray or blue, they're not seeing that temperature change that we are. And in fact, my counterparts who work in those states for the land grant extension maybe are not paying as much attention to this attribute as we are up here. But nevertheless, you can see that there's disparity in the signal. There's a snapshot. This is worth mentioning just because of all the hubbub that was raised about this back in January. In January, the Hadley Center in Europe and NASA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, all in the same week, had press conferences to declare that 2014 was the warmest year globally in the record back to 1880. And that's a simple depiction of what the measured data showed in 2014. From a temperature standpoint, the warm areas obviously highlighted in pink and red, cool areas in blue, and you can see that overall the globe indeed was warm in 2014. What's striking about this analysis is warmest year, and if you look at the other top 5, there's an El Nino presence. There's the equatorial Pacific Ocean when it gets extraordinarily warm. That's a player in most of those other warm years. But in 2014, it was not a player because the El Nino signal was, if you will, in the neutral phase during 2014. So this is kind of emphatic for us in climate science that have been observing these behaviors, that we would have the warmest global year since 1880, but without the presence of El Nino. That's kind of an important observation. You can see, though, that cold prevailed through the midsection and in the North Atlantic there. In fact, state by state, the National Climate Data Center tells us that these are the relative rankings of 2014. So in Minnesota here, we had the 22nd coldest year. Wisconsin was 9, Michigan 10, Illinois 6, Indiana 7. So I guess the conclusion for our Minnesota culture is, well, that's obviously where the sinners live in 2014. I mean, somebody had to have a cold year, right? So we were where the cold air decided to go in the year 2014. Out here, and we've all read about these states, California, Nevada, and Arizona had their warmest year of record. And unfortunately, in the midst of multi-year continuous drought, in fact, Nancy Sellover, the state climatologist in Arizona, who I follow pretty regularly, there are climate divisions in the state of Arizona that are in their 21st consecutive year of drought. So I don't know when you call that the new normal. I don't know how many consecutive years you have to have. But that's really amazing that that aberration, that level of aberration is going on out there. There's our temperature record. Now, don't let this overwhelm you. It's just a pool of all the temperature observations in the state from all our observers, put in one pot to calculate the state mean temperature value for each year since the late 19th century. And if we trend these data, we put a positive slope through it. We put an upward trajectory through it. In the most recent 3 decades, we note that the trend line is even more steeply upward. And we also note that in our lifetime, in the recent decades, in our lifetime, all of these individual data points are above the 90th percentile. So we've really had quite a large population of extraordinary warm years in our lifetime. This isn't just distinct to Minnesota. This, you would find, is the population if you examine the record in North Dakota or South Dakota or Wisconsin or even Manitoba, Canada. There's a seasonality depiction. Again, all these are from the National Climate Data Center. You can see winters up until the 2 most recent, which is way over here on the right. But winters have been skewed very warm. Springs, likewise, except the last 2. The last 2 are remarkably cold. And then autumns and summers. You can also see, and this is a very important point. In fact, this is a point I would suggest that you, if you don't take anything else away today, you take this point away. There's not just trends in our central character of climate, okay? There's not just trends in what the central, the mean values are doing. Around those mean values is amplified variability. Around those mean values, we're experiencing amplified variability. You can see that in the scatter that's depicted on charts like this. There's winter. For example, winter is a situation where we went many, many years with positive deviations in the winter season. We had an upward slope and still have an upward slope of 4.5 degrees per century. But look at what 2013, 2014 was. I was forever apologizing to students at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus because, as you know, we have students that come to the University of Minnesota from states like Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana and Arkansas and places like that. And mom and dad send them up there to go to school, and they experience a winter like that. They wonder, what did mom and dad intend here, you know? Because that winter on the far right here was really, there aren't many historical equivalents. There's 1978, 79, there's 1935, 36, 1916, 1917, 1903, 1904, but it's a scale of aberration, and in the context of the upward trend, it's a real aberration to have a winter that's so dominant. We had in the winter of 2013, 2014, some of you may have heard us talk about this in the media, we had a new record number of sub-zero overnight readings in the state of Minnesota up in St. Louis County, notably at Cook and Cotton and Embarrass and places like that. 103 nights of sub-zero temperatures, which broke a record that dated all the way back to 1875. So that's really a remarkable negative temperature aberration in the midst of this extraordinary upward trend. Values are changing. So what we commonly refer to for frame of reference as a location's normal or average, these are changing whole scale. So in Rochester, Minnesota, once upon a time, their normal January minimum was 1.9. Today it's 7.7. February was 7.6. Today it's 12.4, etc. You can see this occurring in our state database. You can pick a location and find how these numbers have shifted. There's Milan out in Chippewa County, which is one of our pristine historical climate sites because the Op Jordan Farm has kept these data since the 1890s on the same location on the farm, basically untouched. And you can still see on Luther's Farm, once upon a time it was minus 4.3 average January minimum. Now it's 3.7. These are from a statistical standpoint, those of you that work with statistics, frame of reference, these are statistically significant changes. These aren't random. These are real significant. And also we see changes month by month. Now you don't need to pay attention to the numbers here, but please pay attention to the signs. Month by month, as we step through the record, we see month by month values, what we call average, again what we call frame of reference for that location, is getting to be a bigger number. It's getting to be a bigger number here at Lamberton. It's getting to be a bigger number at Austin. It's a bigger number at Wilmer. And you can see some of them are rather pronounced. Some of them are fairly large. That's another underlying point that's important, and this probably is important in the context of agriculture. And that's to understand, okay, we acknowledge temperatures are changing, but they're changing in a disparate pace between the daytime maximum and the nighttime minimum. Here's a depiction of that month by month across the Minnesota climate record of how the daytime maximums have changed with the red bar month by month. They're all positive, although they're minuscule in some of the summer or growing season months. But the red bars are the maximums. The blue bars are the minimums. Just like our predecessors did. Because our legacy that we're trying to live up to, and I would say it's a formidable legacy. I don't know about you, but those who preceded us on the Minnesota landscape, they left us some pretty good role models. They were continuously adapting to the climate. They weren't dismissing it. They weren't poo-pooing it. They weren't saying, oh, let's not worry about it. They were reacting to it. And we need to think similarly, regardless of what some people tell us. We need to think similarly. The pace of change that's going on with some of these climate attributes is a remarkable pace of change. It's a remarkable pace of change. And even though we see these trajectories with its central tendencies, we also have to acknowledge that around those central tendencies, we're getting these extremes. We're getting this amplitude of variation. And we need to pay attention to that. And people who take care of our natural resources, and you all know who I'm talking about, people who look after our Minnesota natural resources, and people who look after our infrastructure, like our fresh water supply, our electric power grid, our public health system, our road system, etc., they need to be paying attention to this. If we've got some people that aren't paying attention to this, that are in leadership positions and are supposed to take us into the future, in my view, they're not exercising very good judgment by dismissing this. Okay? That's the bottom line for all of us as citizens of the state of Minnesota. That this is happening, it's happening profoundly in our own backyards, and it's already having coherent consequences on agriculture and also on a lot of other things. And so we really do need to put this on the agenda. We really do need to discuss this. And we really do need to seek leadership that's going to lay a path ahead that's going to be a path of sustainability and a path that's going to leave a legacy that our kids aren't going to go back and go, shame, shame on you. Why didn't you pay attention to this? Okay? So that's the nature of what I'm going to give to you with the broader brush picture. And we'll transition. David, are you going to introduce Jared?
I will.
Yeah, I can take a question or two. Is that all right?
Okay.
Or do you want to save it for later?
Go ahead.
Okay. Anybody got a question or a comment they'd like to make? Stunned. Is everybody stunned? Yeah.
I just have a question, and I think I understand, but when you're talking about extreme floods and extreme rainfalls, I just would appreciate some clarity on what the metric for a flood is. Are you looking at standing water levels or river levels, or are you looking at extreme rain events? You know, does that question make sense?
Yeah, well, watershed by watershed, we have a different scaling for flood. Each watershed in Minnesota has a minor flood stage, moderate flood stage, maximum flood stage, and then an all-time extreme. So it's all dependent on, basically it's all historically normalized, okay? Flash flooding, on the other hand, urban flash flooding is getting back to those characteristics that you just described. The storm sewer runoff system in a community can't handle it, so you get flooded intersections, streets, washed out roadways, filled up drainage ditches, the whole range of things. And by any measure, all of those incidences are increasing in frequency. You look at it from, well, in fact, you look at it from the insurance industry, you'll see it's increasing in frequency. You look at it from a state agency standpoint, you'll see it's increasing in frequency because of the effects on infrastructure and washed out culverts and a whole number of other things. So talking about it from a purely scaling standpoint it's not very relevant because it's so localized. You know what I mean? Everything has its own standards. But that is worrisome in that the insurance industry has really had to adjust for this. Bob Johnson, the president of the Minnesota Insurance Federation, has an excellent presentation on how the last 2 decades the Minnesota insurance agencies have had to make whole-scale adjustments. And he talks about other attributes than I do, but he also validates the extent of these changes that's going on. Yes, sir.
You were talking about maximum and minimum temperatures. Is that meaning the temperatures are coming closer together at a higher level, or what?
Yeah, there's been papers published about that too, that the diurnal or daily range has contracted somewhat. And you do see that at a number of locations. Again, that's not uniform. It varies, but it has compressed. And also in terms of looking at those extremes, if you look at, as we did last summer and the summer before that and the summer before that, we're breaking more records in the new climate history that's coming out this month. Partly it was due because 10 years ago when I published the first Minnesota State Climate History, and that took me 6 years to do. In that 10-year span, since that came out in 2005, we've broken 8,923 daily climate records in Minnesota. In our climate observation network, we've broken 8,923 daily records. And many of those are record warm nights. Okay, the record warm nights vastly exceed any other temperature attribute. vastly exceed record daily maximums, vastly exceed cold daily maximums, and vastly exceed cold nighttime minimums. It's so skewed to the warm nights, it's unbelievable, because as you'll recall, we've had a lot of nights where the temperature never falls below 80 or never falls below 70. We've had nights in the middle of Minnesota winter that never fall below 40, which is ridiculous for Minnesota winter. So, yeah, that's become pretty evident, especially over the last decade or so. All right, well, I'll get out of here, but we'll be around. Yeah. Thank you.
Jerry Hatfield.
The bottom line from Mark's talk is that it's not your father's climate. All right, as Mark said, that I do work on the intersection between agriculture and climate, and that's what we'll talk about over the next few minutes here. And basically, what are we measuring, what are we learning in all of this? And I'll give you my contact information because I do actually have two jobs now. I direct the National Lab for Ag and Environment, and I direct the Midwest Climate Hub, which means I'm responsible for all the ag and climate aspects from Ohio through Minnesota and Iowa and everything else. So in the past, I just counted up while I was sitting and listening to Mark talk, I've now exceeded 25,000 miles of airline and driving travel since the 1st of January. So if I leave this afternoon, it's because I have to go somewhere else. I want to start off this way in this because there's a lot of confusion about all this different piece of the puzzle. And really think about it from this perspective. Climate determines where we grow a crop. Weather determines how much we produce. And so we'll put that into perspective, and I'll show you a dynamic on this because here's probably one of the most living examples that agriculture is adapting very, very quickly to the changing climate that we see out there. Because if you'd look at corn, soybean acres 10 years ago compared to what it is today, you wouldn't have seen any of those dark green counties in North Dakota and South Dakota. We have rapidly expanded the production area of corn and soybeans into there. In fact, there are counties that are intense in those two crops as any county in Iowa, and it's because of climate. It's because of that increased rainfall that Mark talked about that is extended in there, that little longer growing season, little change in temperature and all of this, and not to mention $7 corn, the high demand for corn, a number of different things. So we dramatically see this because the question I get all the time is, when is agriculture going to adapt to climate change? Agriculture has adapted to climate change for 10,000 years of cultivation. Okay? We continually adapt in all of this. The one piece of this is that we are not going to warm enough to grow bananas in the upper Corn Belt. Okay? So I had to explain that to a British newspaper because they really kind of had a bizarre idea of what the U.S. agriculture looked like. And so we see all of this. And so we look at this piece of the puzzle. In all of this, we look at where this can fit in a different perspectives. But I do really want to start off with this piece of the puzzle. Because if we talk about these climate factors, and we talk about temperature, precipitation, solar radiation, carbon dioxide, those are inputs into agriculture. And they really influence growth, they influence phenology, they influence yield and all of this. And we'll talk about those different pieces of that puzzle as we go along. But the flip side of those is that those same factors are affecting the indirect impacts. They influence the insect populations, they influence the disease outbreaks, they influence the weed populations and all of this. And so those same weather factors each season influence those things which have an indirect impact on crop production. And in reality, when we look at this from a major perspective, is that these indirect impacts are as costly in terms of production as are the direct impacts. And yet we understand little about that part of the whole puzzle. just what are the expanding ranges of insects, what are the changes in intensity of diseases, and what are the changing weed populations that are out there, because weeds are survivalist, and they're going to take great advantage of any disruption of the microclimate that exists within a field or the changes in all of this. But underlying all of this is the soil resource. One of the major pieces that we've ignored in all of climate is the fact that we practice agriculture on top of a very fragile soil system. That system is fragile because of the increased intensity of rainfall, how we manage that system in terms of the overall aspect. And so as a reservoir for soil and water, for water and nutrients, that becomes a critical part of the agricultural puzzle. And it wasn't until the 2014 National Climate Assessment that we really got soils put into the whole discussion on climate impacts on agriculture. And we did that from two different aspects. One was the increased intensity of heavy rainfall events and what that meant for soil erosion, and how that was going to impact long-term our capabilities to be able to provide the soil resource that we have to grow the crops that we need. Plus, when we look at this overall structure in this, is that as we talk about a changing temperature, is that sometimes we've only isolated that to air temperature, but in reality the soil temperature changes as well, which changes the microbial population, changes all the nutrient cycling, changes a number of different things that go along. So it's a big puzzle that's out here, and we can't ignore the soil resource as part of this. The other piece that's in this with this whole increasing temperature that is often overlooked is the fact that as we warm the temperature, we increase the saturation vapor pressure, which really drives the evaporative process. And so the warmer it gets, the more water vapor the atmosphere wants, demands, and if we don't have the soil resource to be able to supply that water back to that crop, we're going to end up with water stress. And so we end up with increasing drought. Everybody remembers 2012. That atmospheric demand that whole year was extremely high. In fact, if we look at western Kansas, eastern Colorado, things like this, in irrigated areas, they could not pump enough water on with the irrigation system to meet the atmospheric demand. And so they gave up in those mile big pivots. First they went down to a half a pivot, then they went down to a quarter pivot, and finally turned them off because they couldn't supply water fast enough to meet the atmospheric demand. That's what 110, 120 degrees will do for you in terms of atmospheric demand and all of this. But when we start looking at this puzzle from a different perspective, is that becomes a piece of this overall structure. We've all seen the CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, they're all increasing at rates in there. From a positive point of view, plants love CO2. From a positive point of view, weeds love CO2 even better. Weeds have responded to CO2 increases dramatically, much more than what crops have done. If we had a crop that doubled its size when we went from 320 to 380 parts per million, we'd have corn that would be 15, 20 feet tall and produce 500, 600 bushels, but we don't have any plant that behaves like this. This projected change in this, and I'll just use a little different graphs. In all this, we're talking about increasing seasonality, increasing winter precipitation, the increasing spring precipitation across there. Here's the part that disturbs me the most, is that the long-term projections are the decrease in summer precipitation. And we built our agricultural systems on reliable summer rainfall. And we are becoming less reliable. And so that means that we're going to have some very different changes that occur over time. The fall precipitation becomes a little bit more erratic. And the surface temperatures we're talking about changing as well in terms of getting warmer, both day and night temperatures in there, but primarily, as Mark said, it's the nighttime temperatures that are changing more than the daytime temperatures. But if we talk about this, is that we are changing the phenology, we're changing the rate of development, we're changing all sorts of different things in these crops. And so when we talk about this from a perspective is that we are changing the seasonality, and we'll show you some of that. This intensity of precipitation, the changing temperature with more extremes in a longer growing season, all of these have direct impacts on crops. They have direct impacts on what we're doing in terms of just how we look at this overall piece of the puzzle as well. And so I'll kind of show you some examples of this as we go along, how it all fits together from a perspective. We've been plotting out in a little different way in this, and this is the seasonality aspect. And what this is we've been looking at the ratio of summer precipitation and spring precipitation relative to the annual total precipitation to say what's the shift in seasonality. This is the springtime in Iowa. This is the summertime. You can see that this spring line is going up and the summer line is going up on the fraction of overall precipitation. And so we are changing that seasonality from a different perspective. I did it in Minnesota as well. Here's your annual precipitation, and here's your, actually both of those are going up slightly on a whole statewide basis, but as Mark pointed out, there's so much regional difference, and when we start doing it by county, we really get a lot of data points in this. And then there's other ones in which we actually have this, again, the same thing that we've seen in terms of this fractionality of you are seeing a decline in summer precipitation relative to the annual total over time, which means that we're going to see a lot more capacity for water stress because this is shifting in late summer during the grain filling time when we really need to make productivity. We're going to end up with more and more cases of stress. Heavy downpours in Iowa, just like in Minnesota, is that we're seeing more and more fractions of rainfall occur in this heavy precipitation events. The shifting seasonality is really this point right here. And that is the fact that when we looked across Iowa as part of the National Climate Assessment, and we'll show a little different piece, is in that April through mid-May period. In the 15 years from 1995 to 2010 compared to the previous 15 years, is that we actually had reduced the number of workable field days in a 6-week period by almost 4 days. That means that we have 4 less days in a 6-week period that we try to get planting done, fertilizing done, all these different things. We have 4 less days to get it to do. And that really ends up costing in lots of different ways. It costs from the standpoint of some improper decisions it made because sometimes we work fields too wet. And so we end up with sidewall compaction. We end up with a lot of compaction in crops. We end up putting chemicals on fields in which we end up the increasing probability of runoff and erosion off of those fields. A number of different things that can be attributed back to this lack of workable field days. And so we spent a lot of time looking at this. This is the Iowa average. For every, we lose 1 day for every 2.6 inches that are out there, and so that changes all of this. But an interesting statistic is that we plant 1 million acres of corn in Iowa a day in the planting season, because one of the things that we've seen change with all of this is that we go to larger and larger planting equipment. It's not unusual to see 24, 36, and now we have from 48 row planters, which takes 2 fields to turn around in. But but that just shows you the magnitude, and the shifts has been because of the changing types of climate that we have out there. So we looked at all this. This is actually the whole Midwest average across all those years. They're pretty much the same thing, except this one outlying year in which we didn't have any heavy precipitation. And so we think we can pretty well develop a risk profile across the whole Midwest in terms of workable field days, what's happened in terms of seasonality, what's happened in terms of risk, a number of different things. And we've been doing this not because of corn and soybeans. We've been doing it for other production systems. If we look across the whole Midwest, 75% of the land area is in corn and soybeans, and 25% is what we call specialty crops, anything other than corn and soybeans. The biggest piece of that puzzle, where we're seeing a lot of impact in terms of this changing seasonality, is in the labor management relative to small producers, because a lot of our vegetables in Michigan and Ohio are hand harvested. And their biggest complaint is not about the weather disruption on production, it's the weather disruption on labor management. And so we're looking at how do we have workable field days, how do we develop risk profiles in terms of how they schedule laborers, and how do they contract laborers in the future in all of this. Mark showed this changing relative humidities. We've had a 12% rise in atmospheric water content in the last 42 years across that. This is actually just for Des Moines that we've looked at. So it has gotten more humid, and it's really very dramatic. It changes the whole water vapor profile in the atmosphere, that severe storms piece of the puzzle, but it changes the atmospheric demand from that standpoint as well. And so that really begins to change the overall dynamic. Go back to the same piece because I'm going to show you just production records.
And so in cropping systems, would either of you care to project on what kind of a cropping system we as farmers should be looking at in introducing this diversity in relation to what we see as climate change?
I'll give you my perspective, and Mark can give you his. I think that we're going to have to go back to a mixture of small grains and row crops because I think that spreads out the risk through the profile and the profile of the growing season. If you look at this, and I'll come back and use an example from Kentucky that we've been working on. Corn production in Kentucky is becoming extremely risky. You notice that those soils there are relatively poor, and their shift in seasonality rainfall is showing a lot less late summer rainfall, and which corn wants all its productivity. So you have a lot of counties in Kentucky that corn is really a very risky venture. And so they've been promoting wheat production back into those counties to the point that the state even went and promoted a mill to take care of the wheat. And so that there's an economic incentive for them to grow that. So I think that becomes a piece of the puzzle. I would like to see a much more diverse rotations just from an entirely different perspective. One producer asked me what economic crop they should grow, and I told him marijuana, but you know, with every state legalizing marijuana, I really think that somebody needs to capture that as well. But you know, that's an entirely different crop to look at. Just kidding. You know, but I think there are crops that we could grow. There's a lot of efforts going on and demands for crops that may be considered niche markets, but have a place in rotations from a different perspective. But I look at it from how do we spread the risk relative to the weather events within the season.
So, really, it couldn't have been set up any more perfectly. I have a great privilege to quickly talk with you today. I know I'm the guy standing between everyone and lunch, and that's I don't want to hold you too long to get there. But so I have the privilege to talk today about this really big project that's going on up at the University of Minnesota right now called the Forever Green Initiative. And really, we're talking about developing new crops, specifically winter annuals and perennials, that can help diversify agriculture. We're not just doing that, though, in a way of thinking about the environmental objectives, which are, of course, very important. But we're thinking about it primarily from an economic perspective, and how is it that we can develop economically viable crops. And so today I'm going to quickly go through here, and we'll talk just very briefly about context. I think that we won't need to spend much time on that. And then generally, what is this Forever Green Initiative? And then I'll give two case studies of of kind of pulling out little individual research projects from this larger initiative and then we'll talk quickly about next steps. So, context. When we look at the Midwest from above, we see something like this. So this is, you can imagine what our legend on the map here is. So we have brown, and if we're looking April 20th to May 3rd, what are we looking at here? Someone just shout out.
Bare soil.
Bare soil. Okay, we're looking at a lot of bare soil. If you go a little further south, you're maybe seeing a little bit more perennial agriculture. So, and that's exactly what the next slide tells us. And as we go through the growing season, we see this begin to shift. This is a common story. We observe this every year. You guys live on this landscape. By mid-July, this is what we begin to see. And then, again, we see decreased vegetative activity as we move into the fall there. So when we start to line that up with other things, specifically annual tile drainage water loss in a corn and soybean rotation, we're seeing that July and March, we're losing about 29% of the total loss during that time period. The rest is April, May, and June. So and you can imagine all the things associated with what we've been talking about earlier today. And when I look at this, and I think when a lot of us in the Forever Green Initiative look at this, we think lost resource primarily is what we're thinking. We can go forward again and think about statewide end resources to waters, and so this would be a wet year. And focus on the big part of our pie here. Cropland tile drainage, 43%. Cropland groundwater, 30%. Okay. Again, when I see this, and I think as when you see this, we should be thinking lost resource. And so this puts us into kind of this series of questions of what-ifing. What if we put something here that captured nutrients, that captured water, and that maximized capital use? So land is a capital investment. How do we get the most out of it that we can? And that really means that we have a major economic opportunity here. And I know that as my family's sitting here, and as I see lots of familiar faces, we're always looking for new ways to bring new industries and new vitality to our rural economies here. And so I think that there's a potential for some big win-wins. And it's also a major environmental opportunity. I don't want to diminish that. But I also want to state that it could potentially reduce or eliminate the chance for command and control regulation, which is on the forefront of all of our minds given recent reports coming from Iowa and also from our state capital. So can we find plants to maximize this opportunity? That's the big question. And that's where we get into the Forever Green Initiative. So what we see here is, so we have this, the idea is we have a new crop. So we're specifically talking about winter annuals and perennials. And obviously, there's going to be breeding efforts that happen, and work with some phenomenal plant breeders up in the department. And then there's also going to be the agronomy research that needs to happen. Now, that's the tried and true method of what we do in the agricultural sciences. What's new, particularly for row crops, maybe not as much in horticultural products, but is that we want to do supply chain development. We also want to focus on end users to make sure that we're having that pull from the landscape all the way to where it's going to be consumed. And then finally, we want to model and consider the potential environmental impacts of what these new crops are going to be doing at the landscape scale, at the regional scale. And then also thinking about what are going to be the broad economic impacts. So that's kind of the theory. Now let's talk a little bit more specifically about we have a suite of plant-based enterprise development projects. I'm going to list them here. I'd love to talk more at length about all of these. There's also web resources that I'm happy to pass along too. But we have crops ranging from field pennycress, camelina, winter barley, hairy vetch, winter rye, Kira clover, intermediate wheatgrass, perennial sunflower, hazelnut, native plant polycultures, looking at some of cosmetic bioproducts, and native plant natural products, perennial flax, and agroforestry. Now, I want to focus on pennycress, which is the first one on our list, because it's one that's pretty close close at hand. I see some snickering. I think that there's also a pretty potentially there's a weed. Am I not correct? Yeah, and that's a big deal. And I think that we really need we need to have long conversations about that. What I'll say though is that the process of domestication is the process of bringing a plant, a weed, a plant that's not being used immediately, and bringing it into the fold. And we're saying, hey, this thing now responds as we need it to on our landscape. And so we can snicker at that, but I think also, too, when we go back and we look at the origins of corn or maize, or we go back and we look at the origins of soybean, we can see a similar trajectory. It's just we're doing it in a little bit smarter way now because of some of the new genomics technologies that are allowing us to do that. So pennycress, it would be winter annual, and it has the potential to be a very profitable oilseed crop, specifically going into existing biodiesel infrastructure. There's also potential to use protein for food and feed. And really we're thinking about this in terms of a double or relay crop with soybean. And so when we look at all of kind of the reasons why we went to pennycress, in spite of its kind of negative, the negative perceptions surrounding it, it's an extremely cold tolerant winter annual. There's rapid seed maturity, high oil content, like I said, double or relay crop potentially with soybean, and diploid. What's that mean? Okay, it just means it's easy to breed. We can get results quickly. That's the big take-home point with that. And so when we look at it as an oil for biofuel, we're talking about high seed yields. So up to 1,600 pounds plus per acre in Minnesota. And I'll show a slide in a little bit so you can see what the yields look like in our kind of preliminary trials with soybean, their joint oil yields. And then the seeds are, because they're high in oil, we're talking 20 to 36% of the weight. And so that works out to be roughly 87 gallons per acre biodiesel that we can get out of this. It's already the ideal composition for biodiesel production, and the technology for conversion to biodiesel is in place. So we definitely have some cultural perception issues of pennycress. I'm not gonna sugarcoat that. I mean, it is a weed, but I think that we need to be very strategic in light of what we've heard this morning, and in light of the potential opportunities that this plant could offer us in terms of considering it. I'm not saying that this is the best way to go or that this is how we should go, but it's something that we should consider. And that's why it's a part of this huge suite of plants that we're working on up in the department right now. So in terms of what it would look like in rotation, so you have a corn, pennycress, soybean rotation. And so pennycress would be seeded into corn. And so these are pictures taken from field plots. It would grow up in late fall, over winter, and then pennycress in mid-May. You have harvest, and then you plant your soybean no-till into pennycress stubble the first week of June. Some of you in here are thinking, that's kind of late. I don't know that I want to do that. Isn't that June? That sounds like lost yield, and that's a legitimate criticism of you're having to get into the field later. But I hope that this next slide will make you curious about maybe considering it. Fall soybean then with pennycress regrowth. So when we look at the total oil yield, I want you to just focus on these two, that are boxed out. Big thing, because we're short on time, these are bigger. That's the big point I want you to take away. It's pennycress and soybean total oilseed yield on a kilograms per hectare, and they're bigger than the rest when we're looking at it against other covers, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is significant because you have to start thinking here. If we're going to be having shifting resources under a changing climate, we want to access those resources. So, and if we're going to do that by diversifying, how can we make sure that we're going to total, our system total is going to be economically profitable? Now, the economics are something that we're still crunching through on this repeatedly, and that changes, and that's changing all the time, as you're very aware of with economic markets. So I'm going to skip over some of the breeding details here just for the sake of time. But this is not a perfect plant yet. This is not something that I'd recommend you throw in your field tomorrow. But it's something that you might consider doing 3 to 5 to 7 years from now, based upon the rapid trajectory that we have with this crop. And some of that is, and a lot of that breeding is focused on oil content. It's focused on improved seed characteristics, flowering time, faster flowering particularly, and then decreasing seed dormancy. And the cool thing about this is we're actually drawing a lot of our knowledge from this quote-unquote model species, Arabidopsis, which just means, hey, we got a plant, we know a lot of stuff about it because everybody researches it in the plant biology community. We can use that information on this plant because they're really similar genetically. So the second case I want to put before you is the one of strategic biomass production. And this one is more, this one has less to do with the plant development side and more to do with social organization and economic organization. So when we talk about strategic biomass production, we're thinking about, we have native mixtures, we have switchgrass, we have corn stover. And these are potential inputs into cellulosic fuels. And really the question, though, is what is going to be the economic and environmental performance of these different types of feedstocks? And potentially, there's significant risks associated with certain types of feedstocks. And I have Audrey looking at me here, and she's thinking, Stover, there could be some very significant risks associated with that. And those are considerations that need to be discussed. And there's sustainability standards that are beginning to be developed associated with that. But so that's at the big scale what we're starting to think about. And there's other people in the room that actually know a whole lot more about this than I do even. It kind of all hinges on this new technology that's coming out of Michigan State. Long story short, you have cellulose goes into the AFEX process, ammonia fiber expansion. Fancy term to say, hey, inject it with ammonia. What it does, it breaks down the cellulose, and then it allows them to compact it, to pelletize it. So you've taken this big, really difficult to transport item, and you've made it into something that's transportable then. We've also been looking at it in terms of feeding trials, and they're showing that it's a 1-to-1 replacement with corn up to 30% of the ration. And so it looks like a really interesting economic opportunity just on that. There's other already existing technologies. Rotochopper is one in Iowa, and then there's Second Harvest, I think, that's in Minnesota. I might be flipping where those companies are based out of. This is technology that is at our doorstep. It's going to be at our doorstep in a few years here. And so how we're thinking through, though, where do we put these things, and then what's the economic and environmental performance is through this kind of cool touchscreen system that we call GeoDesign. And it's a spatial decision support tool. And this is the work that I'm directly involved with. And you see here, it's a GIS that you can draw on. You can say, hey, what happens if I put this crop right here? And then you draw your polygon. And then it looks something like this. And then you're able to go forward a little bit more. And hey, what do you know? Because of David Mulla's amazing modeling, we're able to actually see what that landscape performance is going to look like, both in terms of environmental outcomes and in terms of economic outcomes. And then it allows people to compare designs between them. And if you're interested in playing with this, I think there's an IP address that's live, and we can set you up on just a on a laptop even, and you can look at it. And this is what it looks like. We've been using it in group collaborative processes to help people push and pull on ideas and to think about negotiating. Because kind of the social and economic landscapes. And really it comes back to is if you can get the right group of people in the room, hopefully they can come to some form of consensus as to what should or could happen. Next steps, and then I'll let you go to lunch here. So Field Pennycrest is nearing a varietal release from the University of Minnesota. Now that's significant because it's nearing. It doesn't mean it's happened already. Because there's further genomic and agronomic work that needs to be done. Some people look at this and go, oh, shoot, it's not here yet. I look at that and go, hey, this thing isn't solidified yet. We haven't established its genetic trajectory fully yet. That means that there's time for input. And when we're beginning to look at moving into larger scale field trials, this is the time where that input can happen, where you can say to our breeders, these are the phenotypes that we want. This is what we want out of our landscape. And then they can look at what they have in their existing germplasm and say, we can deliver that, or based on this, we can't deliver that. And it allows for that dialogue here as we're going into version 1.0 of this crop. And that's really what I'm saying here is for the next steps is this dialogue process. What should this final plant look like? And how should we get there? These are value-oriented questions. These are not questions that, that scientists typically like to address, but we're finding ourselves having to address them more and more. And what we're really looking to do is find funding to engage in this broader dialogue about these should-oriented questions. On the how should we get there side, I will note there's all of these new genetic engineering techniques that are coming out. They're not under the extreme regulatory pressure that the first generation genetically modified organisms are under. Now, some people look at that and say, hey, we've got a super huge opportunity to utilize this technology to lead us to a diversified landscape. That's the logic that they play. Another set of people would say, that scares me. We could make really dramatic changes to these plants and have very large-scale landscape outcomes. And that's something that needs to be discussed very broadly and across multiple facets of society. So with that, a huge list of funding resources, and I don't want to stand any longer between you and lunch. And with that, thank you so much for having me today. It's a privilege and an honor to speak in front of you.
This program was made possible by the University of Minnesota, Southwest Minnesota Regional Sustainable Development Partnership, and by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency.